Hi, this is Claire Dawkins for the online high school, leading in a YouTube tutorial, a teaching workshop about how to teach the paragraph, writing the paragraph and close reading of a sonnet at the same time. This is a practice that I use with my students, and as my model, I'm choosing John Donne's Batter My Heart Three-Person God, which is Holy Sonnet 14. And this is not an actual paragraph written by students, but it is indicative of the type of paragraph that students might write in class together in a workshop. So the first thing is I modeled close reading for my students, and this is very similar to what we would normally do in the classroom anyway. And so to begin by asking students to explain the metaphor in each quatrain of the beginning octave of the sonnet and then also in the sestet. So here's the sonnet itself. And so I asked them to really kind of focus on the line in the quatrain about knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, and also break, blow, burn, and make me new, which they are pretty quick to kind of think of this as some type of either like glass blower or metalsmith, somebody who is using heat and physical force in order to make something. The second quatrain, the idea of a town that's been usurped. Sometimes they're not really thinking in terms of walled cities, so that can be helpful as well to think about that. And then in the sestet, the idea of the beloved spouse, the betrothed, particularly one who the allegorical relationship between, bride and bridegroom is now transposed onto, God and his faithful, or to Christ and the church, and that issues of kind of sexual chastity become important for the poem to explore as we consider kind of how these three dominant metaphors, the metal worker, the usurped town, and the bride, how those three relate to each other, especially if we think of the bride maybe even being indicative of the New Jerusalem, who's, figured as the bride of Christ at various parts in the Bible. So once we go through that, then I ask students to look at alliterative words, assonance, and consonants, which pretty much points them to that strong kind of line, break, blow, burn, and that each one of those words that's drawn, kind of the attention is drawn to through the alliteration is a verb, and that each one of them would be, if we were scanning the poem, would be emphasized. If there's time, I ask students to scan the poem themselves. If there's not time, then I'll kind of do it for them. And, one of the things that we think about is how the beginning part of the poem, because all those verbs, those monosyllabic verbs are stressed, there are all these spondees kind of thrown into the middle of an otherwise iambic line. And I also point out to them that in early modern English, if you had a word like to that then was followed by admit, the vowel in the to and the vowel at the beginning of admit, that they'd kind of ally together so that instead of to admit, it'd be tadmit, so that that helps them to kind of scan the line to realize by the end of the poem how very regularized the iambic pentameter becomes. And so then thinking in terms of how, what does that mean that there's these spondees thrown in? It sounds really shouty. It sounds really angry at the beginning whenever, and those consonants too, break, blow, burn, that's a hard consonant sound. So they get that pretty quickly, that the opening quatrain in particular is a very shouty quatrain, and that by the end of the poem, the meter is regularized and therefore is less angry sounding. I also ask them if there are words that they don't know. They almost always don't know viceroy and ravish, so that's good to define both of those. And then to think about how these kind of all fit together. What does it mean that, we have these dominant metaphors, that there are these important vocabulary words like ravish, which is important because it means to rape. that how does all this kind of work together? And they're pretty quick to come up with this idea that the poem is about willpower, the attempt to forcibly surrender willpower. And so the last thing we kind of think about is the fact that the poem is about, I want to lose my will, but that the speaker is demanding or commanding God, take my will away, do this, I command you to do these things. So there's a tension there between, a heartfelt desire to have the will erased and then, an assertion of will, that I want you to do this thing, God. So that's a good starting point in terms of opening up the poem as having a lot of richness to kind of latch onto as far as something to write about, make an argument about. So from them, I kind of ask them, I find it's very useful with teaching writing, even if I don't think it's always useful for like more advanced writers, but for beginning kind of to explain the what is a paragraph, how does a paragraph work, how does an essay work. Sometimes it's easier to, rather than have the entire possibility of ways that we could make an argument about it and maybe boil it down to a debate, a kind of either or, a like false dichotomy as a strategy for teaching. And so I do that for this poem, where I say we can either read this as if Dunn's speaker is making a legitimate prayer, kind of making the argument that, free will is a paradox. We are only really free when we surrender our will to God. Or that the poem undermines the speaker's claim and suggests that the prayer is a kind of heresy. So that the speaker wants the easy way out. He doesn't want to do the work of living a holy life. He doesn't want to take responsibility for his sins. He's asking God to do all the work. And I found it's really useful to just have the class vote, and they can kind of debate about why they think one or the other, and that kind of helps them to already articulate what they think is the most convincing evidence either way. And then we have a kind of hypothetical thesis that I write on the side of the board. We choose one that, the poem says one thing, but the speaker in the poem says one thing, but the poem does another. So therefore, Donne, the author, undermines the moral philosophy of his poem's speaker. The second possible kind of working thesis that I propose is that the speaker and the formal structure of the sonnet work together to suggest the paradox that believers are only free after they surrender their will to God. Donne supports the moral philosophy of his poem's speaker. And in the past, my classes have kind of divided. Some have voted for the undermine thesis, and some have voted for the supports thesis. And it just kind of depends on how their little debate goes. So for the sample that I'm writing here in this teaching workshop, I guess, is to think, I've used the supports, the moral philosophy, I kind of randomly chose. So this would be after they have voted for, a thesis that would be governing the entire essay. Now they're going to work on just one body paragraph. Okay, so I tell them that the paragraph has to be very coherent in its argument, so you can't really lump together everything. You're not going to say rhythm and alliteration and metaphor and, adding all these different things, because those would be smaller arguments all in support of the larger argument. And so they pick together what they think would be coherent evidence. And it doesn't have to all be rhythm. They could maybe say that rhythm and alliteration work together, which is what I'm going to show that in the upcoming slides, so that they don't have to just stick to one poetic device, but that their poetic devices should make sense and be logically put together, rather than just a string of random things. And then after they've kind of gathered their evidence, then they go back and make a topic sentence. Then they kind of think about how their evidence supports their topic sentence. And then they write their conclusion. So there's a lot of kind of, circularity, I guess. So we're going to look at rhythm and diction. And are they at cross purposes with each other? I here say yes, but sometimes, in the writing process, you end up changing your mind, which I did later. So here were some kind of observations that they had about about the text, that the rhythm, the meter goes from chaotic and harsh to smooth and even. It seems to calm down, but the diction at the end seems very charged because ravage is not a calm word. So what trumps the other? And so that's like that question there will lead them to an argument as opposed to a statement. So which trumps the other? And so here are hypothetically the types of evidence that they might choose. So obviously a bunch coming from that first quatrain because the quatrain was the most uneven. And then the final line where we see that tension where, the iambic pentameter is perfect, but the diction is incendiary. Oh, I forgot to say that from looking at this, we might have said that, which trumps which. We might have said that rhythm, maybe, the meter might trump the diction, so that the overall tone of the poem seems to kind of calm down despite the diction, and that suggests maybe that the speaker on some level has or is in the process of surrendering his will and is calming down because he has surrendered his will. So here, for this first piece of textual evidence that as a class we've chosen, now kind of thinking then how does meter maybe show itself to be trumping diction? So we have our piece of evidence and then a sentence to kind of explain that argument, that the verbs are all stressed in these lines. So the listing of verbs means that there are some spondees thrown into an otherwise iambic line. The rhythm makes it sound like the speaker is shouting. Then here would be some sentences of explanation for the second piece of textual evidence. The pattern above is repeated here, but the alliteration of the B sound makes the stress even more exaggerated. Also, the verbs in the two lines correspond with each other. The word break intensifies knock, blow increases breathe, burn augments shine, and make me new strengthens mend. The rhythm and alliteration work together to increase the poem's sense of urgency. So you can see in a way in which the original topic sentence that rhythm trumps diction is still kind of in effect here. Then moving forward to that last piece of textual evidence, whereas the diction and the rhythm worked together before, they work at cross purposes in these concluding lines. Ravish means rape, but the lines are now in perfect iambic pentameter, so they read as calm lines even though the subject matter is incendiary. It is paradoxical and strange that the speaker asked for God to rape him and that he asked for it calmly. Okay, so now then kind of putting it together, thinking in terms of how these sentences would be organized to construct a paragraph, that we can go back and then refine and then think about if what we've actually argued is that topic sentence, and we did not. We actually kind of ended up working in a different direction, so that we were thinking that diction and rhythm in the poem alternate between working together and working against each other, and that creates a kind of paradox, and that paradox in fact reflects other things going on in the poem, such as the paradoxical relationship between free will and submission to God. And so now we have been able to kind of refine to make sure that our topic sentence is working with our actual, what we've argued in our analysis. And so now we have to kind of wrap up the paragraph. We have to kind of, in the last part of the paragraph, we have to think about how this relates to our working hypothetical thesis that we had, that this poem, the poem corroborates and supports the prayer that the speaker is making. So how does this local argument that rhythm and diction sometimes work together and sometimes don't, but that this comments on the speaker's relationship to will, how does that argument help to support the larger argument in the thesis that Donne the writer corroborates his speaker's philosophy about willpower? Here's one possibility, that this is something students have talked about before. It is kind of a hot button issue, but it's one that I think helps them to, again, construct an argument about the poem, so that the poem on some level is drawing from discourse about rape and how we distinguish between rape and consensual sex, so that if you ask to be raped, then you're not actually being raped, since the definition of rape is to force a person to have sex against his or her will. So if you ask, then you are giving your consent. So you can see why this is a hot button issue, but this is the type of response I've gotten in the classroom before. And then to take that even further, that in comparing the question of consent to the speaker's relationship to God, the poet suggests that the speaker has already reached an ideal state. He has not surrendered his will because the entire poem is a series of demands. However, in his frequently repeated demand to be overpowered, he gives his consent to God. The diction and the rhythm may work at cross purposes, but they do so in order to clarify this paradox about a Christian's relationship to free will. It takes active, hard work to surrender your will to God's. Okay, and so then, again, we would kind of then think about how the paragraph fits together. And so that last part of the paragraph would be kind of tying it back to the thesis. So obviously this exercise makes very long paragraphs, so you could even tell students that they don't have to necessarily have 3 pieces of textual evidence. They can focus on one if they need to. But this is just a good thing to model within the classroom if you're especially able to use your computer to project this, or in my case, I can use my computer within the classroom because it's hard to write all of that quickly on a board with chalk, but it works better if you're typing. But anyway, this has been really great for students in terms of helping them to kind of see how an argument's constructed, and how especially that the argument kind of draws from the text in those green sentences, and those are the places where they usually need the most development instead of continually just adding more evidence. And they also have a tendency sometimes to flip it, so they'll make an argument and then they'll try to find evidence that supports their argument, but then it's kind of like they're trying to make the text fit what they're arguing instead of drawing their argument from the text. Anyway, I hope that this was helpful. Thank you so much. Goodbye.